Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I'm your host, Kyle, and today I want to do something a little bit different. So, for the last few weeks, 2 months almost now, we've been talking about Catherine the Great, her life, her exploits, the actual kind of hard and fast history of who she was, where she was, what she did, and who she did all that with. Those kinds of things, the kinds of things you can go look up in a book and find a date and a place, all that fun stuff. But today, I want to talk a little bit about Catherine's legacy. Not her historical kind of physical legacy, not like, oh yeah, there's a city named after her now, or oh yeah, here's the territory that she took and how that affects Russian politics to this day. That is all very interesting stuff, but it's not something that a lot of people really know, or even to be perfectly honest, are that interested in. Instead, I want to talk about Catherine's cultural legacy. And this is something that I think is honestly at least equally as important as her kind of physical legacy. So there are two things that I really want to kind of focus on in this episode today. The first off is Catherine's gender, that she was a woman. And the other would be her sexuality, that being she had a lot of it. So these two things are very intimately, badoom crash, intertwined. And a lot of it has to do with, one, reality. Of course, Catherine was a very sexual person, and she was a woman, so, you can't kind of escape those things. But also, because these are generally the things that I feel like most people really remember Catherine by. On that point, I think it would be very interesting if you all could just kind of think back to before you started listening to this series. Think about what you knew about Catherine. What were the kind of words and ideas that pop into your head when you thought Catherine the Great? I'll be perfectly honest. Even as somebody who understood that Catherine was a very important person and understood a little bit more about, say what she did and why she was an important person, the first things that really popped into my head were that, one, she was an empress. She was a female ruler of Russia. And two, all of the sex stuff. And if you aren't familiar with kind of all of the sex stuff, I highly recommend you kind of do a deeper dive into that because I can't get too far into it here because it would take us on a pretty serious tangent. But I'm almost certain most of you guys have heard of some of this stuff. I'm pretty sure that you guys are all basically aware that Catherine's a woman, and I'm pretty sure that most of you have at least heard a little bit about Catherine's fairly famous sexuality. So that's why I kind of want to talk about them. We've already talked about the history, the kind of hard facts and stuff like that, and this is the stuff that most people don't understand. And I think that's really a shame, because Catherine can't really just be boiled down into very kind of sexual woman ruler of Russia. I mean, if you want to just boil her down to the most basic kind of pop culture version of her, sure, you can, but that's not really fair to who she is, and really who she was. And now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to defend Catherine the Great's legacy or her image. I don't particularly care for Catherine the Great. I feel like if you listened to the last 2 months worth of episodes, you probably picked up on that. She was a tyrannical, despotic, just real asshole. Real jerk to a lot of people. I don't really have a lot of respect and love and adoration for the lady. But I also think that if we're going to kind of, poke holes in her legacy and poke holes in her image, let's do it for good reasons. Things like saying she was apparently on the side of liberating the serfs, but then on the other hand, in reality, actually did quite a lot to solidify the institution of serfdom. I think that is a good critique of her. And this is where we get into the first issue. And I want to make that sex. Sex, I think, is Catherine's biggest kind of ghost, almost like a little dark rain cloud that follows around her throughout history. And this is very intimately tied into the fact that she is a woman. And so I can't really talk about one without talking about the other, but I'm just mostly going to focus on sex for now. So, as we talked about in one of the previous episodes, the people of Europe particularly, but really everywhere, were very aware of the fact that Catherine lived a fairly hypersexualized lifestyle. She had a lot of lovers, and she was with them a lot. And she not only had a lot of sex, but she parlayed that into important, practical, very usable relationships in her political and kind of cultural spheres. She did a lot of politicking through the bedroom. We've already been over this, but I kind of want to just touch on it again because I need y'all to be thinking about it. And now we get a little bit into, again, like I said, we can't really strip away just sex and gender here because this is where they really overlap. This style of governance wasn't that weird. Don't get me wrong. Catherine was very into this kind of favorite style of government. She surrounded herself with yes men and sycophants like nobody's business. But also, despite the fact that she is well known for this, and for good reason, this was not out of the norm. Basically, everywhere that there were monarchies, and where there were monarchs, you had people being put into positions because they were a friend of the king, because they were a friend of someone else who was important, say a duke or a baron or whatever, or in a lot of times because they were having sex with that person, or because someone they were related to or friends with or somehow related to in, say, either a kind of blood familial way or non-familial way, was having sex with that ruler or important person and was leveraging that for power, influence, money, whatever. This is Game of Thrones shit. And I mean, it's pretty honest to God how things went. Again, Catherine definitely did this kind of more than other folks, but it would not be that hard to go through the annals of any other country's history and find lots of examples of this. So let's bring this back to what we were talking about a couple weeks ago, where Europe, particularly the British, were really harping on Catherine as being, the quote-unquote Christian Amazon, and it's being very promiscuous, and they put out all of these prints and cartoons and whatever, kind of depicting her in a very promiscuous, unflattering manner. And that's because she was a woman. It was okay for men to sleep around, much like it's kind of okay for men to do so now, where it wasn't for women. This was, of course, a very much more kind of openly, overtly Christian society and overtly Christian Europe than it is now, and sex and sexuality were much more closeted, no pun intended, than they are now, especially for women. This was because women were, at that time, much more, certainly especially at this kind of higher level of society, seen as people who were supposed to be away from the action, whatever that action may be, and that their purity and that their goodness was an important mark of, say, a civilized society, of a civilized court. So for Catherine, a woman, to be in charge of Russia, this immediately kind of put people on edge. And for her to be an openly, overtly sexual woman really kind of threw a wrench in people's feelings, in the kind of perceived ideas of, oh, we are a civilized, modern European continent, but then again, here at the East, there's this lady who's out whoring around, and we are, kind of uptight Britishmen, are not very comfortable about this. And this not only played into ideas of sex and gender of the time and kind of, the sexism of the time, but also in the ideas of Russia as an Asiatic, backwards, despotic country. If you can't tell, I'm doing air quotes while I say that. This really all kind of worked together to create the idea of Catherine the Great as, well, the Christian Amazon. And these ideas have been very persistent. I said that I was going to talk about sex and gender as kind of two separate entities, but I don't think I can really do that. I think that Catherine's sexuality and Catherine's gender are kind of almost inextricable because it is so important that people are upset about Catherine and her promiscuity because she was a woman. At the same time, the kings of France and of England and of Prussia and of really anywhere else were doing things that weren't all that different. Remember, when Catherine was still Sophie, when she was a little girl, she saw the kind of promiscuity and open cheating and open infidelity that she kind of would end up basing a lot of her own ideas and politicking on in her own Prussia, in the courts that she grew up in. So this is not something that is unique to Russia, and mind you, a lot of the folks that she was seeing in there, really the folks who had most of the power, they were men. So this was not something totally outside of the realm. This was not beyond the pale. So yeah, I think it's kind of impossible really to extricate Catherine's sexuality and her gender, because they're both tied together in how the world saw her, and they're tied together in how the world sees her now. So I think I've kind of established that at that time, people were not really comfortable with the fact that a openly sexual woman was in charge of a very powerful country. And I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know how much more okay with it we are today. And now I'm not going to go on some kind of big spiel about how, we need to be much more open-minded and much more liberated and all that. I do think all of that. And then I do think that us understanding history would be much better if we could approach it with a little bit more, tolerance and open-mindedness. But I don't really want to turn this into a big rant. So I'm just going to say it in those simple terms. I think we would all be better people and better historians if we understood that these kinds of sexual, what people might call deviancy, isn't really that deviant, and it's old. This isn't some kind of new thing, and it doesn't make people bad. I'll get into it later, but if you want to really harp on a character from history, don't do it because they had sex. That's really not an argument. But, so kind of on that point, that's kind of what I want to talk about now. Catherine's legacy has kind of been tainted, up to this day, by the fact that she was a openly and overtly sexual woman, that she had so many lovers, and that she was not afraid to express it. If you haven't looked up Catherine the Great's sex chairs and the genital furniture that she had, you're welcome to do that on your own time. I'm not going to tell you that you ought to, but hey, it's your free time, it's your browser history, I don't care what you do with it. But Catherine was very clearly kind of into a lot of the stuff. I don't necessarily want to say obsessed, but then again, I don't know. I've never had somebody commission me a chair with penises on it, but Catherine has, so maybe she is obsessed. But either way, Catherine was very into this stuff, and people still remember this. This is the stuff that grabs attention. If you go onto Google right now and type in Catherine the Great, there's a really decent chance that after you scroll through kind of, the Wikipedia entries and the Encyclopedia Britannica stuff, that towards the top is going to be stuff about, did you know Catherine the Great was a freak in the sheets? Stuff like that. And I think that, that's not inherently like a bad thing. I think it's totally fine to talk about this. But I also think that Catherine's kind of more important than just she was a powerful woman who had a lot of sex. I don't think that we need to not have these discussions, and that this needs to be hidden. Clearly not. I'm discussing it now. But I also think that it's kind of unfair to Catherine that this is really what she gets remembered as. She's kind of remembered as this, sideshow, freak show kind of thing. A lot of people are like, oh, haha, it's very silly, it's very funny. She was this powerful lady, she had lots of sex, she was kind of obsessed with it, and then there you go. We just kind of laugh and move on. And to make it kind of worse, we still really haven't gotten past the fact that she was a powerful woman, she did have a lot of sex, and she was overt in her sexuality, and people still hold that against her. Like I said, I'm not here to defend Catherine. I think there are lots of things that you can do to very fairly poke holes in the kind of great status that she has. It would be very easy. I think I've done it, half a dozen times at least already in the previous 2 months worth of episodes. You can talk about how Catherine was a horrible mother, and even though that her husband was not a great husband, she was kind of a horrible person inside of her own relationships. She used and abused a number of her own lovers, and her husband, who, while don't get me wrong, I'm not defending, she did ultimately murder. So, she's not exactly the nicest kind of person you're ever gonna meet. So, as I said earlier, if you want to make critiques of her, just do it. Make real critiques. Talk about her policies. Talk about her underhandedness. Talk about how she lied, cheated, stole to get what she wanted and left nothing for the others. I promise you, there is plenty more that I didn't even talk about that Catherine did that was underhanded and kinda awful. She was the Empress of the Russian Empire, for Christ's sake. People who become emperors, empresses, kings, queens, stuff like that, generally not good people. Especially not the ones that stay in power for long amounts of time. And especially not the ones who have the great at the end of their name. But I'm digressing a little bit. So what I'm getting at is, let's not have Catherine's sexuality be kind of the center of her focus. I think it's totally fair if, somebody decides that they want to talk about Catherine's sexuality, and I think it's totally fair that if kind of, some people want to make that the focus. I'm not going to tell you how to do history, and I'm not going to tell you what to be interested in. But I guess really what I want to talk about, and what I'm really getting at is, I wish that we could kind of refocus some of this, really take it all in together. We can have conversations about Catherine's gender. We should. We can have conversations about Catherine's sexuality. We should. But we can also talk about Catherine as a political, social, cultural icon, what she was at the time, and what she rightfully still should be today. Again, I don't really like Catherine the Great, so this is kind of a weird position for me to be in, to be like, let's defend the image of Catherine the Great. But really, I'm not even saying let's defend her image. If you want to tear her down and knock her legs out from under her, that's fine. I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. I think that the people who do talk about Catherine's history do way too much to put her up on a pedestal. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, we need to defend her image and we needed this and we needed that and we can't talk about sex because it'll make her look bad. No. One, that doesn't make her look bad. It shouldn't make her look bad. We should not be using Catherine's sexuality as a weapon to attack her, because it isn't a weapon to attack her. There's nothing wrong with that. So, really what I want to say is, if you've never heard the story of how Catherine the Great died, I'm going to tell it to you now, because I think it really encapsulates everything I'm talking about here. And so the story of Catherine the Great's death is a little bit different than, how she actually died, because this is in fact just a story. A little bit of a content warning. I'm not going to say anything particularly overtly gross or graphic, but this is a story about sex, and I don't know, this may make some folks a little uncomfortable, so skip ahead a couple minutes and you should be good. So here we go. The story goes that Catherine the Great died in, let's call it a sex accident, where she was having sex with a horse. And this horse was in some kind of contraption, the contraption broke, and the horse fell on her, crushing her to death. This story is so persistent to this day that if you go onto google.com and type in "how did Catherine die," most of the articles and most of the responses you will get will be about, was she actually killed by a horse? Did she actually die being crushed by a horse? Did she actually have sex with a horse? Stuff like that. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. I'm not really all too upset about people trading in this story, as long as we recognize that it's not the truth. I think it's totally fair to talk about it, because it's an exemplary story of, at the time, this is what people were talking about. This is a contemporary tale of her death to when she actually died. And the fact that it's made it this long really goes to show you that, people back then saw her as kind of a promiscuous, down and dirty person, and we still do today. And we still hold that against her. So let's not do that. Let's be better than the people of the late 18th century, and not be angry with Catherine the Great because she had sex, because that is not a problem. Let's be mad at her because she fucking helped serfdom continue when she said she wouldn't. That is a problem. So, the last thing I want to say, even though I've said it already, is if you're going to go back and talk about historical figures, Catherine the Great or any other, make sure you're really going after them and what they did in ways that matter. I don't want to hear, and I don't think anyone should be interested in hearing, I think that such and such person from such and such time period is bad because they went to orgies. Okay, were they hurting somebody? Especially when maybe they were hurting other people. Maybe they were doing bad things. And not just in comparison is the sex isn't that bad, but it wasn't that bad. It just isn't bad at all. But then on the other hand, they are doing really bad things. This is kind of like telling me, Hitler was bad, but my number one issue is that he cheated at chess. He was a real big cheater. And you know what? Now that's what we're going to remember in 100 years from now. It's kind of that same thing. And now I know some people are going to get mad and say I'm calling Catherine the Great Hitler. I'm not. It's just an example. But anyhow, I wanted to kind of leave you guys with this as we round out Catherine's story. Because, one, I think that Catherine's history is very interesting and it's very important. So that's why I wanted to do that first. But two, I want to help you guys become better historians. That's what this is really about. This show isn't just about Russia. It's about Russia for the average person. And it really isn't even just about Russia for the average person. It's about history for the average person. And I think that everyone out there has the ability, has the skills, has the knowledge to become a better historian, to do a better job of understanding the past, accepting it, and critiquing it. So that's what I want to do here today. I want to put this in your brain. So if you think I did a good job of that, great, thank you. If you didn't, well, clearly I'm not trying hard enough and we'll just have to do this again. So, as always, I'd like to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please leave me a comment on whatever platform it is that you listen to. Even if you didn't enjoy the episode, please do still leave me a comment because your comments help me make the show better, and of course, they make the algorithm happy. If you are interested in keeping up with the show, you can always follow me at BTRSPod on Instagram, where you can get information about Russia, the occasional little extra tidbits of stuff going on both today and in the past, and of course, the occasional pictures of my cats. Once again, I would like to say thank you all for listening. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.